Welcome to this session on narrative inquiry and sense making. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and it will be shared for you to access through the web page. So yeah, we're looking forward to the Outcome Mapping Learning Community's Learning Lab in 2025, where we will be exploring bricolage, a participatory, learning-oriented MEL for systems change. And some of you have already joined the other webinars that we've had, and they're available. We'll put a link in the chat for those who haven't had the chance to join all of them and you'd like to. So today we have Steff joining us, and Steff is a consultant and trainer with over 20 years of experience in learning, monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive programming. A pioneer in the use of narrative-based approaches, he was an early adopter of the SenseMaker methodology within the international development sector and co-author of the first practitioner guide. Since 2012, he's applied narrative inquiry and sense-making in more than 50 projects across the globe. In 2017, Steff founded Voices That Count, a collaborative network of practitioners using narrative and participatory approaches to strengthen citizen participation, participatory action research, strategic planning, policy development, and MEL practices. He has been an active steward of the outcome mapping learning community for over a decade now and continues to serve as a board member. So, Steff, you're very welcome, and you'll be taking us through some different, first an exercise and then a presentation on SenseMaker, as well as, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And if you have questions or comments, put them in chat if you want in the meantime, but we'll take them later in the Q&A time. And then Steff, you'll also be leading us through some reflections on bricolage as well, with some more time for questions and answers, we hope. So that's how we're organized today. Over to you, Steff.
All right. Thank you very much, Mariam. So yes, I'm Steff Deprez. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yep.
All right. So as Mariam said, I'm from Voices That Count. We are a collaborative network of practitioners, experts in narrative-based methods, and we use this for planning, strategic planning, program design, a lot of M&E oriented work as well, citizen engagement, and so on. And all the methods we use have affiliation with being narrative, and one of the approaches is the narrative inquiry and sense making based on SenseMaker. Yeah, I've been working with this from the early stages and been using it in very different settings and contexts, which will become clear as I will be giving some examples. The idea today is to introduce you to the basics of the method. Where does it come from? What are the key characteristics? And how can it be used? And at the end, I will also share a bit of reflections. I had to do it myself actually this week. Like, how have I used it when we look at it from a lens of bricolage, methodological bricolage? And so that was an interesting exercise, not finished actually. I think there is much more to talk about it, but I will share what I have so far. It's a narrative-based method, which means we always start with sharing a story, asking people to share an experience, a particular moment. So I actually would like to start this session with exactly the same thing. So you have a bit of a feel in a very quick way how it feels to be a storyteller on the respondent side. So I have a question for you, which is related to our work. Imagine that I would be doing, or we would be doing, a study or a research on the latest trends within the M&E practice and all the things that people are experiencing this time. If you would reflect and think about the last year, Could you share a moment or an experience when you felt that something has shifted, either positively or negatively, in your malpractice or your thinking about monitoring, evaluation, and learning? Describe what happened in that moment or that experience and how you think it will or could affect your future work. Yeah. So I have a few minutes or 1 minute, I would say, to reflect on what you will tell. In the meantime, you will be paired up with somebody else and you will be invited to share that story to one other person. You will be in a breakout group and you have 3 minutes to share your story. After 3 minutes, you will get an alert, and then it's the other person that can talk, and then you listen. And then after 6 minutes, you will be brought back to the plenary. So
And
enjoy.
the question is in chat. So
And the question is also in the chat.
yeah.
Yes. So enjoy in telling and in listening. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had the time, sufficient time to share your story. In case that was not, you're not in the possibility, then that's not too much of a problem. You know your story, keep that in the back of your head. What I would like you to do later on, there will be a link in the chat to go to that link, and this app will open. You don't need to write a story. That would take us way too much time. You just keep it in your head. But the only thing I would ask is give it a short title, a few words, a hashtag, something that belongs to your story. That would be like a summary of your story, just 3, 4 words or 1 word. And then there are a couple of questions, simple tick box questions. Then there is this slider questions. The way you answer is you take the ball and you slide in between these two extremes where you think it sits. So if it's in your case, really a change and shift around thinking, it's 100% here. If it's only about practice, it will be here. If it's 50-50, it's here. So you can give it own weighting against these two parameters. Then maybe a new question for some people. This is a triad. It's a triangle question. You can move the ball and move it inside the triangle. The closer you get to one corner point, the more weight you will give it to that answer. So the shift that I described in my story is at the level of how I or we organize our work. If you say it has only to do with this element, you will put your ball somewhere here. If you say, no, it's also related to my content, but also how we organize it, then you put it in between here. But this means it has nothing to do with collaboration. So in the middle, it means it's equally, all 3 elements are equally important. So any place you can position it where you want. That's the way you answer this triad question. So then you have another one here, and one demographic question, how many years of experience do you have? And then you submit. I didn't answer one question, I guess. I should give the title. So you need to give a title, otherwise you can't save.
Would you like us to put the link in chat now for people?
Yes, please, go ahead. And then you press the button, and then you should get to this message that it has been uploaded and saved successfully. You will get 4 minutes for this. Let's have a quick look at the results. So this is quick dashboard. We have 13 entries. So I think almost everybody participated here. So what normally you would also have provided your story, which is either if you do an online survey, you write your story, but you can also do it face to face. Of course, I will explain more about that later. What we get here in the dashboard is, at first sight, it's the patterns derived from the answers to your questions. So without reading any story, I can see a pattern in relation to the feelings, which in this case is quite high on being hopeful. And there are a few negative, 1, 2, frustrated, sad, and so on. So if I would be interested in what is behind the frustrated, I can click on it and I can, in this case, it's just the titles. but it could also be the stories. So I would have immediate access to the stories which are behind the figures. So that's the numbers, but also the stories behind the numbers. The same for the triads. You see here, okay, they are coming because I switched on the filter. Let's go to a slider question first. So here you see the distribution between the two extremes. So there's a group here in the middle, then there is some changes in practice, and every bar shows the number of people that sits there and even there. So I could click on this one, and then I would be able to read the stories that are behind that particular set of that particular pattern. So what we do is we start with a narrative, which is a story, which is a story and an anecdote, a moment. And through the follow-up questions, we are able to transfer it and to put it into numbers, in some numeric patterns. And that allows us to see pattern, to do pattern detection within this group. But of course, imagine if you do it with 100 people, 200 or 400, it's getting richer and richer. It's like a mosaic. The smaller you make the pieces, the finer and the more granular your pattern becomes, and the more richer your data set becomes. So this is a triad question here. You see every dot is a story of one of you, and the more stories we gather, so this could be a live feed with 100 to 300 people. You will see the dots appearing as they come in, and you start to see a pattern. So in this case, I could say there is a lot of what you are sharing. I don't know what you are sharing about the shifts, but it has something to do at first glance with a lot with collaboration and relationship issues. And then two are sitting here. So if you want to read these two, you can also zoom in and read them and investigate how is it actually, what is changing in relation to how people organize their work. So that's basically what you have just done, and self-experience now is the essence of the approach. And we go back to the slides. Yeah, so we have seen this. So this comes out is from another project, but again, if you're interested in the stories that are about being proud, then you can select the particular stories that belong to that tagging, which was, by the way, not provided by me as a researcher or the one organizing the evaluation or the monitoring process. It's the storytellers themselves that are self-interpreting their own story through the lens that we have provided, a set of questions. But the power to self-interpret is at the level of the storyteller. So I can read the stories that people themselves have associated to being proud, which I think is already, in terms of some other qualitative methods, it takes away a certain level of bias as well, because I'm not interpreting it through my reference framing and my understanding of the story. It's you that tells me it's about being proud, and that's always correct. So that I have explained, so that's fine. So the more stories you get, the more dots you get, the stronger the patterns become. And there are also some other types of visualizations these days. It's almost endless what you can do in terms of visualization. But that's like the whole point. We start from, for whatever purpose you are doing, if you're doing a scan in a particular group of people because you want to inform your planning or new policies or an M&E process, we are starting from individual stories. And by bringing them together through the follow-up questions, we start to see patterns in this, in the lens that we have provided and around the topics of interest. And that's the essence of the approach, that we try to make sense of the group and the world that we want to intervene with or are interested in, in order to act in it. That's the origins of the method, sits in complex change processes, in complex environments. How can we make sense of the world by reading the system from within through day-to-day stories, through fragments of reality that are out there and that we capture together. And of course, the more you have, the richer your pattern and the finer your pattern becomes. It's also very clearly, if you compare this to a more traditional survey or questionnaire, most of the time what we do is we configure a set of questions around the topics of interest that we would like to know, and we are asking what we want to know. So if you ask questions, and the most extreme thing is using indicators, so we define indicators, it means we are going to measure or ask through surveys the things we would like to know. People will answer what you want to know about something. If you ask people to tell a story around a topic, they will tell you what is important to them through what they are sharing, which is a completely different starting point. And that's also the difference with a traditional survey, where we are collecting fragments of real life. And that is an entry point that is at the level of the experience. So we are collecting lived experiences. While with service, we most of the time go for opinions and facts, which is a very different data element. Something about the origin, SenseMaker, which is basically the name of a software that comes with a methodology, is actually invented by Dave Snowden, some of you might know, the Cognitive Edge Group or the Cynefin company, and specifically developed to understand, to intervene, to manage complex change processes. With a few people already in 2009-10, we found out about this method and we were intrigued by it. Originally, it was mainly, the cases were mainly corporate sector, marketing, intelligence, and so on. But we saw the potential immediately for the more international development work that most of us are working in. And then over the years, we experimented, and since there was no real guide, we had to find out a lot of this approach by doing and by trial and error. We joined our forces, and with 5 people, SenseMaker practitioners, we wrote this book, The Learning Power of Listening, which is free downloadable. If you Google it, you can immediately find it on Practical Action. And it was supported by CRS and Oxfam. At that time, talking 2013, 2018, there were 2 organizations that really invested a lot in it and experimented a lot with this approach. So in a nutshell, what are we? You have done it. We start with a prompting question, the question I gave you, for the same for everybody. Everybody shares their story. And immediately after the story, you are also going to self-interpret, self-analyze your own story through the questions. We call those questions the signifier questions, signification questions. This together comes basically in the back, it's an Excel sheet, it's a CSV file, like in any other tool. And this allows us to change it into patterns, to transform it into trends, statistics if you want. Some tools are more analytical than other tools, but you can apply all the same things that you do with normal data analysis. What we find very important, it's not always the case with Voices That Count, is that we bring back the data to either the storytellers, to the commissioners, to a group of people that need to act upon or understand or decide upon what is to be found in the stories. So it's about reading together, analyzing patterns together, discussing what does this mean for our organization? What can we do now to have more stories like this in the future and less stories like this? So it's used as a sense-making, human sense-making process, but always starting from the stories and the experiences of people. Some examples from prompting questions. So Via Don Bosco is, the Don Bosco schools are all over the world. So they have a particular program around vocational training. So we had a program with them kind of longitudinal evaluation process of 5 years with a simple question. Think of an important experience or situation when you felt hopeful or discouraged about your professional future. This was asked in the beginning of a vocational training project, 3 years after, and 2 years after they were graduated. In that way, with 1,000 people in Madagascar, 1,000 people in Bolivia, and we did this longitudinal study. So we could unpack the whole set of questions was framed, the follow-up questions, the signifier questions were framed around the concept of empowerment. So we borrowed from literature their theory of change around empowerment, and we molded and we formed the questions in such a way that they would give us answers to this, the evolution over these 5 years of the level of empowerment of this vulnerable youth being part of this teaching program. Maybe another example here. This is Tipping Point in Bangladesh, Nepal, where also an evaluation. Share a recent experience about the challenge that you faced and how you have dealt with it. What happened, who was involved, and how did the situation end? Very open question, as you can see. The hypothesis of what we want to understand is actually not reflected in our prompting question, and that's good practice. It's very open. People share what they want to share about, and then you have an idea of what kind of challenges they have, but also how they have dealt with it. This was a particular program on social norms, so it was also okay to have it quite broad. The previous one here, for instance, on farm voices is more focused, especially, for instance, here in the coffee sector. Think of a moment when you felt particularly encouraged or concerned about being a coffee farmer and working with this particular cooperative that you are part of. So that's very more narrowed. It's clear what the scope is. And then but whatever they want to share, whether it's about the selling or it's about the product quality or it's about the loan they get for the marriage of their son, that's all what they decide. Yeah. So we don't tell them what they have to talk about. Yeah. So it's an open exploratory approach. This is the nature of the stories you get. So it's not like, for instance, in, let's say, most significant change, sometimes you can have this very nice constructed stories, well overthought in write shops where a good middle and a beginning and an end, and you tell all the changes that have happened and so on. Here it's the day-to-day rough, raw text or story you would share to each other when you were walking together and you quickly share something, or in an elevator, this 2-minute talk you have sometimes. This kind of things, that's where we are after, except that they are all an answer to the original prompting question that was asked, the same for everybody. So that's the starting point, and then you get a set of stories, whether it's 50, 80, 100, sometimes up to 1,000 or more. That depends on the context and the size of the project. The follow-up questions, the signifier questions, are questions that are trying to reveal additional meaning to the story. So I have asked questions earlier on about your story, which allowed me to have a bit more insights in your story than what you potentially have shared or told in the story. And that's the whole point. So the meaning is not only in the story itself, but it's also provided and generated through the additional questions. As a storyteller, you do this primary assessment or interpretation of your own story. And as you have seen, this is then the trick, is the link towards transforming it into patterns. They are not just falling out of the air, those questions. They are well constructed. The whole art of the method is basically around developing good questions, follow-up questions. And they can be found partly in literature around the topic of interest. So if it's around inclusion or resilience or capacity building or whatever you want to investigate, we will try to see, is there any literature models that you are using as an organization or a particular theory of change that you are using for this? How can this inform the follow-up questions? Because later on in the analysis, this will be easier and more powerful to link it to particular models. a typical framework, like a whole tool, like you have seen and participated in, it's a prompting question for the story, a set of signifier questions, and a few demographic questions, gender, age, geographical scope, and so on, to also allow for analytical processing later once the data is all together. Yeah, I have shared this. The experience is the tip of the iceberg, but through the follow-up questions, we actually try to tap into some more hidden things that for you are part of the story, but not necessarily written and or told in the story. The feeling associated to the story is not something I can directly always see through the words, but by asking it, it's a powerful additional meaning you give to the story, and later for analysis, it's also an important aspect. And there's a whole range of questions. There will be more examples later. This is an example of an entire framework. So a tool, this is for UN Women, where we were investigating the quality and the nature of the relationships and collaborations they had with all their CSOs worldwide. And the staff of these organizations engage in a kind of narrative survey around collaboration and partnership to have an understanding and to learn from it and to improve their partnership models. And that's a typical format, story and then the questions. This has already quite some questions. It's quite elaborate, 15, 16 questions in total, without demographic. So there's still no demographic. Sometimes it's 5, 6, 10. It's also less is more in this tool sometimes, that we have also learned. Something about the collection process, because you hear these numbers, 50, 80, 100, and 500 or 1,000, which you think, well, that's quite a lot. How do we have to organize this? Everything is possible. We have been working online like we did here. That's quite easy. The only thing you rely on, the response rate is not always very, very high. Especially if it's very impersonal. If it's organized in settings like this, for instance, in times of COVID, we have done a lot of group online collections, like a big evaluation with UNDP in 5, 6 regions worldwide. We have done completely remotely with groups of 30 young people, young entrepreneurs, in Zoom sessions, where we actually went through the same exercise that you went, a bit longer. It was 1.5 hour sessions. Starting off with sharing stories, writing them down, looking immediately at the results and discussing and having a kind of focus group afterwards with the group. And that was done a few times in different regions. You can work manually. People write their story on a paper, which is still a very powerful thing to do, ask people to write down their story. Of course, there is a step to be taken to then transcribe it, or you can use apps, mobile apps, tablets, and so on. You can do it in group or individual face-to-face. It all depends on the context, whether it's remote or not, whether you can gather people or not. Those choices or those context factors will dictate what is the best and the most efficient approach. So those are the options. Individual or group is a choice you need to make, or pen, paper, or are we going for a digital? And all have their advantages and all have their disadvantages. Something I want to add here is that something new that we developed along the way, and that is also more of a trend. You also within Cognitive Edge, you see it more appearing, is the idea of a human sensor network, where in advance, in a particular system or a particular group, you are going to identify people that for you are seen as the human sensors. It means that they are committed and willing to share their stories over time. Let's say every month in a particular neighborhood or a particular organization, you identify people, you introduce them to the concept, to the methodology. And once they know it, they know that every month they will get an invite to share a story. In this way, and with additional questions, in this way, we don't have to invest in finding the people. You have them already. And you can tap literally into the sensor network on a regular basis, asking the same question. That's possible, but you can also have different rounds around different topics and anticipate to trends, anticipate to learnings from previous rounds, and then try to dig in particular elements and have this real-time feedback that is derived immediately from the people. And as you have seen, it's real time. I mean, you saw your results in 1 minute. If you do that with 100 or 200 people, it's exactly the same. You will see 200 dots in a triad, and you can start analyzing an hour after or let's say a few days after everybody has answered. Yeah. And if you then translate it into these numbers, you have dashboard, you can see trends over time. If you do it for years or months after each other, you can have individual tracking or group tracking or geographical tracking and have those trends. Around analysis, as you have seen it, it's very visual as a starting point, and then of course the narrative part into it. But we always start with pattern detection first. And I also want to highlight here that you saw this fancy thing with the software, but this is, I've used it the first year in 2009 when I was still working in Indonesia. I worked with cooperatives, with farmers, 80 farmers in a room, and we did this in a workshop. So entirely manual, no digital thing. People can tell a story, people can write a story on a little card, and you have flip charts, you can draw your questions, and you put little stickers or dots, and off you go. And you make sense on the moment, on the spot, and you analyze the stories you share around the topic that you want to share. And it's a very nice exercise to do in the beginning of a workshop around a particular topic, to set the scene, to get to the stories, and to have some first patterns to discuss. So it doesn't always have to be high tech with all the software and the nice analytical things. It's a deeper analysis. It's also nice, but it's not necessary. It's also very powerful. Then there is the software. This is the SenseMaker software from Cognitive Edge. Quite powerful, quite solid, with a lot of functions, and you can do a lot of deeper analysis. There is other software, Power BI, Tableau, any data visualization tool that can read from Excel or CSV you can use. So there is no limit to the visualization possibilities. So what do you get out of this is patterns. This is a peace building project where we do a conflict landscape in 5 different cities, municipalities in Mindanao Island in the Philippines. I'm not reading any story, but I immediately see in each municipality what is the nature of the conflicts that people have shared that happened in the last 2-3 months and that they were involved in, involved or they know about. Behind all these bars, we have the context, we have the stories, as you have seen. So it's patterns and then unpacking and understanding what exactly are they talking about. This is an example from Uganda, where we had this in the north of Uganda, 10, 20 years ago, when there was a lot of attacks by the, forgot the name now, the Resistance Army. And we are looking at the impacts and of that in the current days. As a result of the attacks, the social cohesion in that community is suffering from. This already has a very clear pattern. You see where the dots are situated. And then if you say, okay, there are tensions in family clans, and you can then isolate those stories. And then we found out that we were working in 5 locations, that all those stories here were from one particular location. So that was already an interesting thing. And then you can unpack them, read the stories, just to show that the richness of the method, that within those stories, we can then analyze it and see what is the nature of those tensions. We have land disputes with community, stigmatization, blaming, over war participation, and psychological trauma and violence caused by that. So those are 4 main things that surface by reading. So you have a deep analysis, patterns that tell something. They have an analysis in their own But linked to that, you can dig into the stories to get more content and a richer analysis. I'm going to be a bit quicker. This is the use of comparison groups. In Colombia, with coffee farmers, we had one group that benefited from training and kind of farmer field school type of activities, while other didn't get anything at that stage. And we were gathering stories and could compare them. And in this way, it's part of an evaluation. This is actually within an RCT, actually, that they use SenseMaker, where we worked with the same groups that they were using for the RCT. And very clearly, you see the differences between the patterns in the numeric values, but also in the stories. This is in tipping points. I'm not going to explain the content, but this change in pattern here showed that there is a change happening in the social norms. And so it's a way to also spot things that you would not be able to spot by reading stories one by one after each other and trying to make sense of the text. It's through the answers that we see patterns, in this case, the heat map XY plots, but the differences are in the plottings between different groups, also control group and target group. You see that there is a difference and that there is actually proof of a change in the social norms around particular topics. This I've mentioned. The collective sense-making is an important part, as I mentioned. It's bringing the data together with a group of people that is interested in it. Could be the storytellers, could be the stakeholders, it could be the program team. Reading stories, analyzing them together, and most of the time leading to decisions or action or report writing, whatever you want to get out of it. So it's an excellent method, as I told you, to see the world from within through the eyes of citizens or your network or partners or beneficiaries, customers, and bring that valuable data, both patterns and stories, to the forefront. Very useful when you want to stay tuned with reality and observing emerging trends. I think that has been clear. Also in situations where you have no clue of what exactly you actually need to do in terms of intervention, you can just try and probe and see what are the effects of our immediate actions and probing, and quickly real-time understand what is going on, and then from there dampen the things you don't like and stimulate the things you like. In the next round of collection, you can then see, are we actually seeing new narratives popping up? Are we seeing more stories like this and less stories like this? And use it as a literally navigating complexity. And that's actually the origins that it was also made for by Dave Snowden. We have seen that it's very useful for the hard to measure concepts like inclusion, empowerment, resilience, and so on, which are very hard to bring down to 2-3 indicators. That doesn't really work. We need the nuance, we need the story, we need to have the detail and the richness of the anecdotes and the moments that are shared by people. Okay, it's also important to mention that this is a very good approach for situations where you have really no idea what's going on, and to start formulating hypotheses. So new programs, new settings that you are going to operate, or there is a drastic change in the political context or conflicts and so on, like understanding what is really going on in a very easy and real-time approach to formulate hypotheses from there, which can then be tested later on. And as I mentioned, it's been used in evaluations, monitoring evaluation, context scan baselines, citizen science. More and more, we are also leaning towards some what we call generic narrative pulses, which means that around a particular topic, we formulate it well, we test it in a few occasions, and it's a standardized tool almost. So we have a well-being scan at the moment, we have a youth empowerment scan, we have a partnership scan. If it's UN, it's UN. But if it's another big, let's say, Oxfam organization that works with many, many local partners, they could apply that particular partnership scan. We just have to fine-tune some text and some language and some contextual figures. But the essence of the questions has been tested, has been validated, has been working, and it's very easy. So you can skip the design stage and immediately go into the collection. Okay, I will stop here for a few round of questions, maybe first on the methodology, and then afterwards I will share some examples of real cases and have some reflections on bricolage.
Thank you, Steff. We have a couple of questions we could take coming from chat. Nazir is asking, how do you normally select participants and how many stories are collected for one evaluation, for example?
Yeah. So as part of the design, there is the normal sampling strategy, which has these two questions. So whose voices do we want to hear? That's the critical question, the first question, almost in line with our evaluation questions or whatever you want to understand. And so it's the nature of the people. Who is it? One particular group, or is it different groups we want to hear? So that's a choice you have to make depending on the purpose. And then the numbers, that's also an important one. We have found out, and we don't have scientific proof or evidence for this, but we have found out that we need about 60, 80 stories for each group that you would like to make statements about. So if you have a particular setup and you want to understand the difference between male and female, it would lead to 150, 160 stories in total, knowing you have 70, 80 stories for each of the groups to compare them. Yeah. So if you know in advance the groups you would like to compare and you like to make statements about, then those are figures we normally work with as a guidance for the sampling strategy. This is when you have equal representation. Another approach is that you just go for the normal statistical representation. We had a big study in Timbuktu last year where we had to understand for the entire city of Timbuktu what is going on in terms of the Al-Qaeda occupation that has been there a few years ago. We had an entirely statistical representative sampling approach, dividing it in districts, so many male, females, young people, older people, and we calculated the numbers as if we would do a normal study questionnaire survey or whatever. And that worked very well, and then that's guiding your approach, even to the level that we went to random sampling, going into a street, 3 houses further, crossing the street, 4 houses further, and then having a whole approach within each district to go and collect the stories. It all depends on the how rigorous you want to have your sampling done.
Great. We can take maybe the second question as well that we have on chat from Alex. What is the average rate of participation in an ongoing human sensor network exercise relative to surveys, for example?
Yeah.
Do you experience drop-offs?
I think you have to make a difference between a survey you are sending out and hoping people will reply. I think it's quite similar to normal surveys. We often count 14 to 20% as an average. But the human sensor network is a different idea. People know in advance they are part of it. There is an onboarding and they commit themselves to participate. So you can approach them. Look, you haven't participated in round 1 and now we see you are not so participating in round 2. Then you can be expelled from the human sensor network. The whole idea is that you are part of it, you commit yourself, and it takes a bit of time to find them, depending on the context. But once they're in, normally there are always a few people that can't answer, but normally there is a very, very high rate. Yeah. Because they're also incentivized. You bring back the data, they are part of a bigger group. Like in South Africa, we have an example now within the fishing community. They love to be part of this because they know they will be invited for events. They are part, they can actually reflect. They know they are co-researchers in a bigger process. So there is another incentive to participate there.
I wonder if we just take the last question that came from Nazir again, and then maybe you can share some of your examples.
Yeah.
We can take more questions later on. It just says, do you always use triangles for the different options? Perfect in our example.
So the triangles, the triad question is a typical question for the SenseMaker methodology. And it's a very powerful question because it's, as you see, it's not a very common question, but it's many concepts have three elements. So one of the criteria of a good triad is that you have three labels, three answers that nicely blend together, and you have the feeling that these are the three things. Like I was asking earlier about how it changes how you work, what you do as a job, or with who. This is the three piece out of a model that we use: people, product, process, for job satisfaction. Yeah. So it's not just sitting and let's put some three things together and that's it. No, they are sitting in a model, or they nicely blend together, or we know by experience. So in this case, it's really working very well. Sometimes it's 4 elements or 16 or 20. Yeah, then you have to use other type of questions. The only disadvantage is that if you look at CTO Survey, SurveyMonkey, Cobalt Toolbox, and all those tools that we use, Qualtrics and so on, they don't have that question. It's only SenseMaker that has it pre-made and configured. So that's if you want to use this particular type of question, then you have to use the SenseMaker software.
Great.
Okay.
Do you want to continue with the
Yes.
examples?
I will give a few examples to highlight how we have used it. I've talked about the Trust Fund for Victims. It's from the International Criminal Court in Den Haag. We have done some evaluations on the impact of the reparation programs that are provided for victims, and carried out by the Trust Fund and their partners. So we go in, and especially it's not something you check with cold surveys. It's you go in to listen to people's story and how it has impacted their life, and how the reparations have actually helped or not helped, and what they are able to do now differently than before. So those are stories, and it's a good example of the type of projects where this is really a perfect fit. Another one I already told you about is vulnerable young people of the vocational training centers of Via Don Bosco. So as I said, it's framed around an existing empowerment model. This is a picture from the design workshop years ago, where we were looking into unpacking the concept of empowerment into good signifier questions. The big advantage was that the organization embraced it as an internal longitudinal evaluation approach. So 3 moments of collection with the same type of group. Sorry. So 1,000 people in the beginning, 2017, 19, 21, and we could more or less follow the same group as well. Yeah. Which in terms of the study was, the context was really, really good. Then we did cycles of desk analysis, created a dashboard for it, which allowed people within the organization to engage with it, whether it's from the communication department, M&E department, program management. Everybody had access to the raw data and the patterns and could use it in the way they wanted to use it. And in this case, we had particular workshops first with the program staff and the teachers to read the stories, to look at the patterns. What can we do differently when we read these stories in the way we teach, in the way we facilitate job placement? And then we also coincided with a workshop with the young people themselves who brought up additional elements in this collective sense-making workshops. This is an example from in Papua New Guinea, where there was a big 5-year program on having people be more active through dancing, through sports, and they had a mayor, governor that was really sporty and liked sport and saw the power of sport and movement into the well-being of citizens. And there was a whole program, and then at the end we were asked to evaluate the program. And so we collected hundreds of stories from people that participated in the program and understanding what worked, what didn't work, at what level of their life did it have an impact, and so on. So, as I said, the hard to measure things, trying to unpack through stories and to reveal through this kind of studies. This is the project in Mindanao, Philippines, where we actually started off with the theory of change as the starting point. So that's, and it's actually a baseline study in the beginning, a context study. So the theory of change was made based on what they perceived as what was the case. Or what would work. And then we went into the different communities, these 5 communities, collected stories. We trained about 15 enumerators, I think, yes, and collected about 800 stories. And this was done relatively quick. I think we were only out for like 10 days or 12 days, to give you a figure. Where we had a good number of people because they were easy to find. They were proactively coming to particular locations, and then we could do the collection in particular locations. And that guided actually the formulation in the inception phase of the program. So the program was approved and there was a whole plan layout, but then there was a kind of reality check. And one of the things that happened is that they were sitting a lot on this intra-communal conflicts, while we actually found out that there was also other prominent conflicts that had to be taken into account. So there was already a content change as part of this study. And it fine-tuned the theory of change, and I mean, it had a lot of consequences to the actual implementation of the program. The inclusive business scan is a generic scan, as I mentioned before. This could be applied and has now been applied. It was originally within Ricolto in a lot of value change that we were working in, looking at the inclusiveness of the trading relationships between smallholder farmers and their cooperatives and their connections with the big buyers and the business importers. It's a scan, a generic model off the shelf, whether you are working in Indonesia or in Nicaragua or in Africa, it doesn't matter. We use the same questions, we fine-tune context. Some demographic questions were slightly different, but the rest was all the same, with the big advantage that you collect stories from all over the world and all feeding one particular database. And with an average of 500-700 stories per value chain. And the advantage is, of course, that the off-the-shelf aspect is important. That's the network, sensor network in the fishery context in South Africa, small-scale fishers, where we are training them to be co-researchers, share stories themselves, and also collect stories from people in the community. And all together they are we call them the Ulwazi network, which is like a knowledge network, to do continuous monitoring and feedback around climate resilience within the small-scale fishing in South Africa. And exactly the same process, except that it's always from the same people. Gonna skip this one. That's the last one I want to show, is the journaling, because that's also quite powerful. As I mentioned, is within a particular context, you can invite people to share a story over time. And this is frontline social workers in Canada, where every 2 months they fill in online a new round, and that is analyzed relatively quickly and brought into the next team meeting. And then they were looking at the main patterns and what was derived from the stories to sort out things in terms of capacity, in terms of tensions in the team, or new problems that they faced with that they are actually not equipped for how to deal with it. So a lot of things are surfacing in these stories. And as it becomes a routine, it's actually part and parcel of the process of working as a team and doing your job. So that's another approach. And that's also a way to create volume. If you have 20 people as a group, you can say, okay, 20 is not enough to use this method because you need to have some volume, but you create volume through doing it on a very regular basis, and then you get a rich data set. So in summary, the narrative is always the starting point of this method, including the self-interpretation. That's the typical feature of sense-making. It's you capture voices at scale. Also those that are often not heard, because that's part of your sampling. You can deliberately choose to invite people that are often not heard, and they are equally represented in the data sets without, like in meetings, for instance, sometimes you have this problem that people from more vulnerable backgrounds, they don't speak up, or they can't say, or they feel not empowered to speak up, or dominated by other people. In this case, it's individually, and you bring it together and you see their voice sitting against other people and bring that to the decision table. And I think that's very clear. It's actually a method that holds qualitative and quantitative data in one approach, which often it's separated, are two different approaches, but in this case, it's actually one method that holds the two elements in itself. And as you might have seen, or I can tell you once more, it's also more and more used as an alternative to indicators instead of a smart indicator in a logical framework, that you use a particular slider, for instance, as something that is every 6 months, every year, we are going to collect stories, and you see the movement in that slider to see whether we are moving towards the situation that we would like to have or not have, and then read the stories, why it's not happening, and try to interact on that. So it's providing sense of direction as well in relation to interventions. Then about bricolage. So next week, 2 weeks, we will be together reflecting on bricolage. So I also did a little bit of work on this one. And when I was looking at the cases and all the experience we had so far, I looked at 3 different things, or I identified 3 different things. One is the use of SenseMaker simply with other methods and approaches. Then the integration of other methods in the practice of SenseMaker, and then also using elements of SenseMaking in other methods. That's like another way of bricolage. So for the first one, which is combining methods. And I think this method has been used, if I look at it, in many, many cases, we actually combined it. For instance, a narrative inquiry to understand, have a first scan of the situation. Like, for instance, we had an evaluation with IFAT in Cameroon, where we did a first narrative inquiry, then we paused for 2 months, and then we developed a whole set of focus group discussions and even some extra surveys to dig into particular things that we spotted in the SenseMaker data. So it's somehow this hypothesis generating thing that happened, and then we weren't really sure, and then we investigated much deeper into focus group discussions on particular topics we found in the stories, and also the things, of course, we had to answer for the evaluation questions. So that's a very typical setup. If you use SenseMaker within a combined method approach, then it's often the first method, because it opens up, it's exploratory, and it shows the variety of what is happening. And then with other methods, you can close and get a bit deeper into the details. Well, another approach has been to use narrative inquiry and leading to archetype stories, which were then transformed into digital storytelling, which has a higher communication purpose, then it had a monitoring purpose. But in this case, for that particular organization, it was important to have final products that could be communicated to the outside world, also for advocacy and for recruiting new volunteers and so on. Something interesting that we did in Tipping Point in Bangladesh with CARE was that we started an evaluative process with doing 3 photo voice workshops, which is by nature small n. It was 12, 15 people, I think, girls in this case. And really have a 3-4 day workshop with each of those groups. So a deep dive into photo voice and digging deeper into the context and the stories that surfaced from this photo. So the whole photo voice approach, so to speak. And that was used to develop and design the SenseMaker tool, because it was contextualized and we used that information to define the questions. And then from there, we went large scale in the different communities, up to 600-700 stories, I think. So in that sense, it's 2 methods or one method is informing the SenseMaker to go to a larger very common is there is a theory of change, or we make one for an evaluation or for a midterm or for the beginning of a program, then we use that as an inspiration for the SenseMaker tool. And if it's more evaluative, like it was for the UNDP Youth Economic Empowerment Program, you can combine it afterwards. So it's spotting the changes and the most important aspects with some light contribution elements in the follow-up questions, but not sufficient to make hard claims. But then, in addition to it, there was a contribution analysis process that was, as a follow-up. We are sitting here in the mixed method kind of setup. Another one interesting that I did, some people of you have maybe already heard about causal mapping, where we use SenseMaker. We have, in this case, it was 100 stories in a social innovation project in Brussels. And we wanted to understand the system. It was a contribution to making a bigger system map. So we unpacked each story in these causal linkages. So the elements that were mentioned in the story and that were connected to each other, we highlighted, and then we used the causal map software from Steve Powell to input that and to actually create the causal maps, which was an interesting thing, how elements are connected to each other, but entirely based on content from the stories, not from what we think and experts think, but no, what people think in the neighborhoods in Brussels. So that's also an interesting one, because from here, in terms of program development, this could be the start of a theory of change or defining your interventions. So as a program design or guiding your programming, it's a very powerful approach, I think. Then the integration of other methods into SenseMaker. So what I have not mentioned yet, but it's actually quite common in many cases, is that we start with a story. We start with questions around the story. As you have seen, every question you answered was in your story, and then you answer something in relation to your story. But at a certain moment, we can also say, okay, now forget about the story. Now that we see you anyway here, if it's a face-to-face interview, for instance, you can still build in a survey into the SenseMaker. So in the tool itself, you build in 2 particular elements. The same with photo voice. We can ask people to share a picture, share the story, and then have the signification questions. Or if you are more interested in longer stories, we have done one recently in a study around people and the treatment of cancer. One prompt was not enough. It didn't give us the content. And then we actually wanted to dig deeper, and it almost led to most significant change kind of approach. So we had different prompts that would follow after each other, but we treated them as separate narrative elements, like 4 or 5 elements after each other. And each element was also followed by some sub-questions, follow-up questions. So together we were constructing a larger story from people. If in case you would like to do life stories, for instance, that could also be an approach. So you're not bound to just ask one story and then that's it. So we actually went to see how do you, some of these guidelines you have for most significant change, they're asking different sets of questions. And you could easily transform that into a SenseMaker combined with self-interpretation stories. Something we have also done in evaluations is to, because it's not so common to do it, SenseMaker is normally about tell your story and the moment and so on, but deliberately asking in a second prompt about the contribution and unpacking the contribution in detail, especially when you are asking stories about change stories that happen. So you are building in a bit the elements, you can say what we do with outcome harvesting or with contribution analysis, asking the right questions on unpacking the contribution and the mechanisms of how things have changed. And then you have a data set of stories, but also, and change stories, but also how the contribution worked. Through the eyes of the people, it's always important. How should I explain this? So outcome harvesting is often at the level of institutional actors in the society. The moment you are getting into a situation where you would like to have outcomes, changes in behavior and practice of a lot of individual, let's say community members, like hundreds of community members, it's a bit difficult to do a more traditional classic outcome harvesting approach because every person has his own trajectory of change. So you could, or we have already done a kind of SenseMaker approach, asking for individual stories, but the type of questions that we were asking in the framework were actually it could have been an outcome harvest. So it's very much inspired by the logic of outcome harvesting, as you can see there on the left side. And so in this way, we in the SenseMaker tool is inspired by the approach and the way normally you work with outcome harvesting. And then bringing all those stories together, you get a full picture or a rich picture of the changes that have happened through an outcome lens at the behavior change of these people, and then make statements about a particular group. So, and if you then see that it's representative or sufficient numbers, you also have a statistical basis to make some claims around the changes that have happened in that particular group. It doesn't work if you work with societal actors where there is only like a few. Then I don't think this is the right tool, but it's this large N things. Using elements of narrative inquiry in other methods, we have done some photo voice projects, and we have always added now layers in the workshop of self-signification, adding additional layers of meaning to the pictures through the triads and asking questions. So you use the pictures to physically put things in patterns and then as a group use it as a workshop method. And actually that's what we do in outcome harvesting already as well. You can use these triads as well in a follow-up or self-signification or afterwards as an analyst and work with triads. Or what we do a lot in outcome harvesting and collective workshops is putting these outcomes into particular questions that require discussion and sense-making together. But at the end, it's a nice output to have, and you can dig a bit deeper in levels or additional meaning to the harvesting process. I will stop here.
Great, thank you so much, Steff. You've taken us through the method and some examples, and we all have lots of questions. I think some of them we'll keep for when we see you in Sri Lanka. I'm glad you'll be there with us. Maybe a few that we really need to touch on. One of them being on software. There's a question from Barbara are you saying that you can set up another software as easily as SenseMaker, as software for doing the questions? If not, is there any group pooling access to SenseMaker? And I know you've got some responses.
Yeah. So yes, so the original software is called SenseMaker, and with SenseMaker, Dave Snowden and the team Cognitive Edge also has this methodology. There is also a lot of literature around it, very interesting, a lot of videos and whatever. We have, with our practitioner guide, focused mainly on the concept of the methodology, the participatory angle, the learning angle, and the power of narrative and stories. We are a fan of the SenseMaker software in a way that it's very solid and very powerful. So many projects we use that. But in essence, as I said, if you would look at the workshop method, asking a story, a narrative part, and having questions to have more meaning to the story, that in itself you can do with any software, whether it's Cobol Toolbox or City Survey, Google Forms. I mean, it doesn't matter. You ask first for narrative, and then you ask additional questions. There is a disadvantage maybe is the triad question, which is not configured in any, that I know of, any other software. So that's our existing software. The visualization aspect, which is also very nice within the SenseMaker software. As I said, it's a CSV file. You can easily use Power BI. I have projects that only work with Power BI to visualize the triads, Tableau. These days, it's all not difficult. It takes 10 minutes in Cloud to have the program for the triad, and there you have your visual. So it's very easy. But it's a choice you have to make. And most of the time, the choices that I see made is that what do we have in the organization, and can we use the tools that we have to make sure it's embedded in what we have. In terms of the licensing, indeed, we have, as Voices That Count, we have what we call collective licensing or an organizational licensing, where we are not allowed to sell just as the license to people that we don't work with, that you have to go directly to Cognitive Edge. But if you work with us and we guide you through a process, it's part and parcel of what we offer. So we have an arrangement around that. And prices are really varying. It depends on the scope, the timing. It's a user-based thing. I mean, doing to connect 20 people or one person, it's already a lot of difference. So it's very, very different in nature. But it's never an obstacle to use it. I always say, I mean, the totality of a process, training people, collecting, analyzing workshops, I mean, those are bigger costs on having a software.
Great. Thanks, Steff. One last question maybe before we need to close today. How do you explore contribution or causal pathways with SenseMaker? Through the signifier questions? Phil is asking.
Yeah. There are ways. We have worked with, as I said, an additional prompt that is after the change story. We would then ask contribution story. So people would literally narratively answer something related to the contribution. And then we also have a set of questions that we can ask as signifier questions to highlight the contribution aspect. And the power is, again, if you have 100 people, they each individually have their own thinking and perception about contribution. But when you put it together, it's not, most of the time, not a clear-cut thing. If it's clear-cut, it's very nice. And then you have a good, solid statement. But there is also nuance there, and then you have to further investigate it. I would say if it's really about making hard claims, evidenced claims about contribution, like we do with contribution analysis or process tracing, you need to do some additional things. It's not going to happen only with SenseMaker. It's a rich data source to get started, but or along the way to validate certain things, that's also possible. If you take a more holistic approach to contribution analysis, then somewhere in the process you could do a very targeted sense making to shed some light to particular dimensions or mechanisms or whatever you want to investigate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steff. And I hear you're saying we can use it with software, but we can also use it more as a workshop approach. I think Barbara, she was curious about how we could learn about that as well. But I think we'll save questions for when we're together in Sri Lanka, and really looking forward to seeing all of you there, exploring these methods and how to combine them. And I'm curious about outcome mapping and journaling and sense making or using SenseMaker.
Yeah.
Let's see how that could be. Great. Thank you so
Cool.
much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And
Thank
see you
you.
soon.
Thanks so
See you
much.
soon.
Thank you all.
Bye.